Jin, Nina, and Yin arrived in Gale, a bustling city teeming with people, just as they had expected. Their eyes were drawn to the large entrance that led into the dungeon below. Yin mentioned that, in ancient times, this grand entrance was nothing more than a gaping hole leading down to the dungeon. But as more and more adventurers flocked to the area, the city began to grow. Jin couldn't help but notice how well-informed Yin seemed about Gale. Yin explained that his family owned the branch of their shop here, and he often visited with his father. His family mainly traded with mid-sized clans. Clans, he elaborated, were essentially groups of adventurers. Smaller clans might consist of only a handful of members, while the larger ones could have hundreds. Being part of a clan provided adventurers with a stable base of operations, which was why most adventurers in Gale were part of one. Some clans, however, used their power as leverage to get what they wanted, intimidating merchants into making deals on their terms. They decided to head to the guild first to gather some information. The guild hall was massive. Jin couldn't help but think it felt like a modern shopping mall. As he approached the receptionist, a large drunken man suddenly cut in, mocking Jin and Mina. He suggested they hire a bodyguard if they didn't want to run into any trouble. The receptionist quickly intervened, shooing the man away and apologizing to Jin. When Jin handed over his guild card, the receptionist's eyes widened, and she let out a shocked gasp upon seeing his S-rank status. The surrounding adventurers were stunned. Some even began to consider recruiting him for their own teams. Jin explained that his high rank was due to his rare abilities, though he still lacked real-world experience. Without much delay, he was sent to the 5th floor of the dungeon, an area very few adventurers had ever reached. While Jin and his team waited in the reception area, a girl named Mona approached them. She introduced herself as their new guide. In this guild, adventurers received personal assistance based on their rank and skills, and Mona would be their go-to for any advice or help they might need. Jin immediately understood why other adventurers might envy him. After greeting their dungeon guide, he wasted no time and jumped straight to the point, asking about the necessary equipment and important details regarding the dungeon. Mona explained that monsters would continuously respawn, but once defeated, their remains would disappear, leaving behind only a few items. These monsters would eventually reappear over time. The items left behind, like magic stones or body parts, were called drop items, and they could also be found inside treasure chests scattered throughout the dungeon. Jin thought the whole dungeon seemed highly organized, almost as if someone had deliberately designed it that way. Mona then warned him not to overextend himself, cautioning that the deeper he went, the stronger the monsters would become. She added that no one had ever reached the deepest floor. Adventurers reported that the environment drastically changed between floors. One might be blisteringly hot, while the next could be freezing cold. So, Jin would need gear to handle both extreme temperatures. Most importantly, Mona emphasized the need for quality footwear. She suggested Jin visit the guild's shop to pick up the essential items for his journey. After covering the basics, Mona told Jin about a special request from the guild. They needed him to collect magic stones. Due to a recent war, Gale was running low on these stones, and not many adventurers were actively hunting for them. In this world, magic stones were as essential as batteries. They stored magical energy that people used to light fires, create water, and power everyday necessities. While these stones were vital for daily life, low-level adventurers were too focused on survival, and high-level ones avoided the lower dungeon floors, preferring to seek out rare treasures. That's why Jin's team was assigned the task of hunting slimes, creatures known for dropping magic stones. Once inside the dungeon, they found themselves in a wide, open space. Before long, slimes started appearing from all directions. Jin quickly gave instructions to Nina and Yiem on how to deal with them. At first, Nina struggled, so Jin had to step in and help her. But after a while, she got the hang of it and managed to defeat several slimes on her own. Yin used his sword and wind magic to clear out the rest. When the slimes disappeared, they were left with a pile of magic stones scattered around them. Yin remarked that he didn't even feel tired after the fight, thanks to a few charms. Jin explained that when you battle tougher opponents, your experience points increase in real time. He suspected that the energy from the monsters was being converted into experience points. When he checked their stats, they had leveled up significantly. They decided to take on a monster room to level up. According to the map, there was a slime room on the 3rd floor, but only adventurers ranked B or higher were allowed to enter. Monster rooms were filled with a specific type of creature, and once inside, you either had to survive for a set amount of time or defeat all the monsters to get out. Jin, confident in their abilities thanks to their enhanced charms, assured them that they were easily at B rank level, so they agreed to give it a shot. When they reached the slime room on the 3rd floor, hundreds of slimes swarmed from every direction, far more than they had anticipated. Jin felt confident that Ian could handle the situation, but he wasn't so sure about Naya. As Nana struggled to fend off the slimes, Jin unleashed a massive water cyclone, sweeping through the room and wiping out all the slimes in a single powerful attack. Jin, exhausted from using his water cyclone attack, quickly drinks a mana potion to recharge. Na, feeling guilty over his earlier mistake, apologizes to Jin, but Jin reassures him, saying it's no big deal. In fact, he points out that both Na and Ian's XP had increased thanks to his attack. It seems that just being near someone using powerful skills can boost your stats. Ian then suggests it might be more beneficial for each of them to gain experience individually, so they continue fighting the slime monsters they've been encountering all night. During the battles, Nina picks up some new shield skills, but despite facing wave after wave of slime, they still hadn't gained enough XP. So, they decide it's time to move on to a different floor. Na, however, voices his hesitation about entering the goblin room. He can't stand their awful stench. Jin agrees, adding that goblins don't drop great items either. Their options are cobalt monsters on the 9th floor or orcs on the 15th. They opt for the kobolds, as their item drops are better, and they don't smell as bad as goblins. Besides, orcs have thick skin, which would be tough on their weapons. Kobolds seem like the best choice. Na is excited to experience what adventurers go through firsthand. They made their way to the cobalt chamber on the 9th floor, where a magical circle served as a respawn point for the cobalt monsters. After a few moments, the kobolds started appearing from the circle. Ian and Jin jumped into action, taking them down one by one. Even Nina managed to defeat one after giving it her all. Jin then conjured a towering wall of water around them, trapping the kobolds outside. Inside the water barrier, they decided to take a break, gathering loot and weapons. Ian suggested that they should use magic more often instead of just relying on physical movements. While Na couldn't use magic himself, Jin was able to enchant a weapon for him, and Na was thrilled at the thought of using magic. However, Jin pointed out that Na didn't have enough mana to sustain magic. Ian mentioned that Na could always drink potions, even though they might be a bit pricey. Jin agreed and gave Na a magic weapon that could shoot small water orbs. When Jin lowered the water wall, the kobolds rushed in for another attack. Nina kept hurling water orbs while chugging mana potions. After a while, Jin raised the water wall again to give them another breather. Na, having downed way too many potions, couldn't hold it in any longer. Embarrassed, he admitted his situation, and Jin enchanted a box for him to relieve himself. Na was a bit mortified at first, but finally found some relief. After 3 days of battling, they managed to take down a large number of orcs in the orc chamber on the 15th floor. Ian remarked that by that point, he had completely gotten over his fear of orcs. Meanwhile, Na couldn't wait to cook some orc meat for their next meal. After 3 days of relentless fighting, Ian and Nina's stats had increased significantly. Jin then announced that they'd head back to the surface after clearing one last room. This final room held an orc general. The plan was simple. Nina would cast spells from a distance while Jin and Ian would engage in direct combat using their own magic as well. As soon as the orc general emerged from the magic circle, it lunged at them. Jin struck first, landing several hits, while Ian and Naya unleashed powerful magic from behind. Ian quickly caught up to Jin and engaged the monster with his sword. Thanks to their coordination and teamwork, they managed to bring down the orc general with ease. After the battle, Na eagerly gathered the orc meat for cooking. While he was at it, he spotted a strange round object wobbling with an odd smell. Being the son of a merchant, Hien immediately recognized what it was and warned Jin. Jin quickly ordered Na not to touch it. It was an orc's testicle. Later, Na whipped up his special orc meat soup and served it to Hien and Jin once they had returned to camp. As they were enjoying their meal, a male elf suddenly appeared, drawn in by the aroma of the cooking. To their surprise, the fairy introduced himself as Luke, the leader of the Elder Clan 3. With a smile, he expressed his delight in finally meeting Jin, the renowned sorcerer he had heard so much about. Curious, Jin checked Luke's status and found that, like himself, Luke was an S rank. However, Luke didn't possess any special abilities. This led Jin to assume that Luke must have incredible skills to reach such a high rank without rare powers. What caught Jin's attention was Luke's exceptional archery score. Hien, standing nearby, informed Jin that the Elder Three was the third most influential clan in Gel. Jin, intrigued, asked Luke why he was there. But before Luke could answer, several people standing behind him approached Jin, begging for food. Luke quickly explained that his clan had run out of supplies and had to travel back up from the lower floors. However, with the number of monsters they encountered, it was taking far longer than they had planned. If they didn't make it back soon, starvation was a real threat. Luke offered to pay Jin for food, but Jin had a different idea. He asked for information instead. Luke agreed, as long as the information wasn't something confidential. Nina prepared a delicious meal for everyone, and the whole group couldn't stop praising her cooking. After they had eaten, Luke admitted he never expected to enjoy anything other than dried meat and bread in this place. Jin replied with a smirk, explaining that he had stocked up on plenty of ingredients and cooking equipment, just in case. As they ate, Luke began explaining the clan system in Gel to Jin. He told him about the two dominant clans, the Purgatory Debts and the Envoys. Some referred to them as the Big Three, including Elder Tree, but in reality, Elder Tree was much smaller compared to the other two. These two major clans used their power to maintain strict control. Those with weaker abilities were often treated as cannon fodder, thrown into the labyrinths where they either perished or went insane. Joining one of these clans came with a steep price, literally. The membership fees were so high that many couldn't afford them, forcing some to leave. However, leaving a clan was considered treason, and no other clan would take them in after that. That's why so many ended up with Elder 3, where freedom was valued above all else. Luke confessed that he wanted to help as many people as possible who had left the bigger clans, but he knew that would put a target on his back. The other two clans wouldn't let him off easily. Ian nodded in agreement, adding that the two major clans had a notorious reputation even among merchants. Yet, despite their bad name, their influence still held weight, and many people joined them for their fame, only to regret it later. Jin thanked Luke for the valuable information, and together they successfully made their way to the upper levels. Before parting, Luke expressed his gratitude for the meal and hoped they would cross paths again. He warned Jin to be cautious, as rumors had spread that the two major clans were targeting him. After Luke left, Jin turned to Ian and Na, curious about their experience in the labyrinth. Na grinned, saying she had a great time, while Ian remarked on how useful a whole experience had been. Ian suggested that if they recruited staff from the estates, Jin could even form his own clan. Jin then mentioned that his next trial was approaching, which meant they needed to return to the capital soon. He instructed Ian and Na to take a well-deserved rest before their journey. The next day, Jin presented the spoils of his 3-day adventure at the guild. Mona's eyes widened nervously at the sheer number of bags, realizing she'd have to tally everything. As she sifted through the items, she found an orc's genitals in one of the bags. Surprisingly pleased, she knew these parts could be sold at a high price, since they were highly sought after for medicinal purposes. At that moment, a man approached Jin and greeted him. He introduced himself as Dan, the guild leader. Dan congratulated Jin for clearing the boss chamber in just 3 days and informed him that he was now eligible to take the temporary B rank exam, with Dan himself as his opponent. The test would be a trial of endurance. Jin had to withstand Dan's attacks for an entire hour. Dan was curious to see how someone who had rapidly climbed the ranks with rare skills could defend himself. Jin couldn't help but feel the test was a bit unfair for those who specialize in offense. However, Mona reassured him that it was only a temporary exam and wouldn't affect much. Dan, overhearing, interrupted with a smirk, warning Jin not to get overconfident because he wouldn't be holding back. Dan continued to taunt Jin, and Jin, growing annoyed, decided he had enough of the man's teasing. Finally, they moved to the Gamel Branch Arena to begin the test. With all preparations complete, Jin enchanted every part of his clothing. Dan allowed Jin to use defensive spells and his sword, as long as Jin didn't actually hit him. When the match began, Dan launched relentless attacks, but Jin held his ground, defending himself with ease. For a full hour, Jin endured Dan's constant barrage without breaking a sweat. Dan, clearly impressed, admitted that it had been even tougher than what Snow had warned him about. He complimented Jin on his flawless defense, acknowledging just how skilled he was. Dan realized during the match that Jin was far more formidable than he appeared. While Jin seemed to be casually deflecting Dan's attacks, he was secretly targeting the same spot on Dan's sword over and over. If the fight had continued much longer, Dan's sword could have broken. In the end, Dan conceded defeat and invited Jin to the library to discuss something in private. Meanwhile, Mona instructed a few inexperienced adventurers to tally up the loot Jin had brought back. She informed Jin that the total value was impressive. Now seated in the library with Dan and Mona, Jin listened as Mona informed him that, as a temporary B-rank adventurer, he no longer needed an escort while traveling. However, she still suggested it would be wise to keep some form of security. Dan disagreed, pointing out that Jin was more than capable of taking care of himself. Curious, Jin asked Dan what he wanted to discuss. Dan began to explain Ash's situation. Although the guild had released Ash, his father still felt the need to atone for his mistakes and had come to Gale. Dan asked Jin to speak with Ash and negotiate a deal with him. He recommended that Jin sign a contract with a merchant he knew, as Ash still needed to sell his goods. Dan felt sympathy for the man, whose eldest son had ended up as a slave and whose youngest son was causing trouble. He hoped Jin could lend a hand and help resolve the situation. Jin's opinion of Dan changed immediately after hearing this. He had thought Dan was selfish and abrasive, but it turned out he was actually quite kind-hearted. Jin assured Dan that he would take care of the situation and would meet with Ash in a few days. Later, Jin and Ian met with Ian's father, who apologized for Ash's rude behavior. Jin accepted the apology on the condition that Ian's father promised to take better care of his son. Jin also agreed to a personal business contract with him. With Ian's help, they quickly worked out the details. After the meeting, Jin suggested Ian spend the rest of the day with his family. Returning home, Jin was welcomed by Mima and Angie, who handed him a letter. As Jin opened it, he realized it was from Chris. In the letter, Chris mentioned two slaves named Elsa and Esther who were staying at the BR estate and requested a meeting with Jin. The names left Jin stunned as he read them. Seemed to recognize Jin.